Hi, this is Nancy Chanteau, and this is the monthly maintenance call for the Thought Cleanse. And today I wanted to talk about trauma. When we experience some sort of trauma, there's this whole process that happens in the brain where the trauma gets recorded in our memory. It gets recorded in a different part of the memory system than a normal event. Normally, something happens, it gets recorded in our short-term memory system, neocortical memory system, and it immediately starts to fade. And we might remember something about that conversation, but we won't remember precise experience. We won't necessarily remember a lot of the details. We might not remember things correctly. We might remember things from our perspective, but not everything that happened. Oftentimes when trauma happens, the level of intensity of our experience records that memory in the limbic brain instead of in the neocortical brain. And those memories are much more vivid. People will report a trauma memory being like watching or being in a 3D, full sound, full spectrum sensation movie, being surrounded by the experience. And when the thoughts that are looping are based on that kind of experience, just stopping them with our gesture probably won't be powerful enough. What we need to do is desensitize the trauma memory before we can stop the thought. So when we're desensitizing a trauma memory, what we're looking for is being able to notice that we're having a trauma memory first. And then we're going to want to be choosing a desensitization practice that has intensity to it. So examples of intense desensitization practices could be something like holding your breath, squeezing all your muscles, doing jumping jacks, brushing your hair, brushing your skin, drinking hot or cold liquid or hot and cold liquid back and forth, tapping your temples. The EFT, emotional freedom technique, is all this tapping as well as EMDR. This is why EMDR works, is that we're doing something intense to help desensitize the trauma memory. And the memory will start to fade out of the limbic brain. So the next time we recall it, we'll not just recall the memory, but we'll also recall our intervention. And then if we intervene again, we'll recall the intervention and the intervention in the memory, and it will just keep fading out like that. So once the memory has gotten faded to a certain level where it's no longer intense and like a 3D movie, we'll be able to go back to stopping the thought with our sound and our gesture again. That it's almost like we're moving it out of the limbic brain and back into the neocortex and letting it become something we can move away from. Sometimes there's a belief system that goes with a trauma memory. Sometimes we have to do some cosmological or some story work around our trauma memory where, for example, we could, in relationship with a trauma, think that we should have protected ourselves or we should have done something to stop it. And these self-forgiveness processes are also going to be an important part of desensitizing it, because our story will, the intensity of the story will hold the memory, will fix the memory in a stronger way. And so we want to notice if the story is still there, even though we've desensitized the intensity of the memory. We might still have a story about that memory, that situation, and we might need to make a plan around it in order to integrate it, go talk to somebody, accept the effect that it had on us, understand how it made us stronger or how surviving it changed us, and then forgive ourselves for anything that we're holding ourselves accountable for in regards to that memory or that event. So we might have some story work around the trauma as well. Essentially, once we've desensitized the trauma memory, we should be able to start stopping it. So if you notice yourself trying to stop a recurring memory like that and it's not stopping, try the desensitization practices and then go back to stopping the thought. One of the things with trauma, all kinds of, especially with some situations where we were dealing with recurring traumatic events, people will feel like desensitizing one memory is an overwhelming task to have to desensitize the whole thing. And I tell people not to worry about that, that you don't have to desensitize your entire trauma history. You are able to, if you just work with things as they come up, that's plenty. And there might be a trauma memory that you know bothers you and you want desensitized because you know you struggle with it. Go ahead and pick that memory. You can pick that memory, recall it, and desensitize it by choice because you don't want to get grabbed by it in the moment. Or you can just wait until something comes up, and when it comes up, as soon as you recognize that it's a trauma memory, then you start the desensitization process as soon as you've noticed. I mean, even if you have the trauma memory at 8 a.m. and you don't think about it as trauma until 3 p.m., don't worry about it. Just desensitize it at 3 p.m. when you realize it was a trauma memory. Go recall having that experience of being in the memory and then desensitize it then. You don't want to necessarily bring that memory up without the desensitization process ready. So you want to have something that you can do. And I like for people to have both a more intense desensitization practice, like, holding plank for 3 minutes or doing jumping jacks could be really potent and intense. But it might not be something that you would want to do in public. So I also like people to think of, like, what would you do if you were in public or driving your car, some place where you wouldn't be able to fully just start doing jumping jacks or something like that in the middle of a cafe. You might want a more public intervention. So somebody, when she was going to have a conversation that she knew was going to trigger her history, she got hot tea and iced tea, and she switched back and forth between drinking hot tea and iced tea to help her stay present and desensitize any memories that were coming up. And that really worked for her, and it's totally something you can do in public. Also, the desensitization practice of, I learned this, it's called blending with a contraction. I learned this from Stacey Haynes in Somatics and Trauma. She talked about how you can inhale, and I'd like to do a full breath first. Inhale, take a full inhale and a full exhale. And then on the next inhale at the top of the breath, hold your breath and squeeze all your muscles. So as you're squeezing all your muscles, you squeeze your fists and arms, squeeze your elbows in towards your waist, squeeze your shoulders, squeeze your legs, squeeze your belly, squeeze your hips, squeeze your buttocks, squeeze your feet, squeeze your toes, and squeeze everything you can. And then when you need to exhale, let everything go. And in between doing that, you want to, when you let everything go, come back to normal breath. So let your breath return to normal. And it might take 10 or 20 cycles of breathing after doing all of that holding and squeezing to come back to normal breath. But you really want, especially if you struggle with anxiety, you really want to let your body come back to normal first. From there, once you've come back to normal breath, if you still have some tension or trauma on the memory, you can do it again. This idea of blending with a contraction, we have all of these unconscious holding patterns in the body, and if we tense ourselves and hold our body, our brain will get the message that it doesn't need to hold that thing anymore. It doesn't need to hold that shape. It doesn't need to hold that unconscious pattern. Something outside of it is holding it, and so it can let go. The brain will let go of that holding. And then when you release your breath and your muscles, the holding pattern that the brain was holding will let go too. We see this in body work all the time. This is what we talked about when we are releasing armoring. So when you're dealing with something like a large number of historic traumas, you don't have to seek it out. You can just wait for a memory to show up and then desensitize it when it shows up. That's a lot less overwhelming and a lot less threatening than having to go through every single memory and desensitize every single memory. One of the things that can happen when we have trauma memories is that, one of our responses to stress or to trauma can be to dissociate. And if that's what's going on for you, like I said, as soon as you come back to consciousness, you want to do a desensitization practice. If you know that you're dissociating and you're consciously aware of your dissociation, you can just immediately do an intervention. If your dissociation is so strong that it actually takes you away from yourself, so much so that you're not even consciously dissociating, that your attention is so far away that you don't feel yourself and you go numb, you might need assistance. You might want to, that level of trigger, you might want to to do some desensitization with support, like do some EMDR or do some body work, somatic body work around trying to desensitize that pattern, rather than letting it grip you and getting stuck in the 3 days of dissociation before you recenter, because that just seems really overwhelming and extreme, that you don't want to have to deal with that level of a trigger anymore. So you might want to get some help rather than trying to do it all yourself. So let me talk a little bit more about self-forgiveness around trauma. Even though oftentimes with a traumatic situation, either we're dealing with powerlessness, we're dealing with a situation like a car accident where there's nothing under our control, or we're dealing with a situation where there was a perpetrator and there was somebody doing something to us, very often our under individualism, our strategies for dealing with danger involve trying to put ourselves in the center of the story. And as we put ourselves in the center of the story, we can get this pattern of believing that we should have done something to stop it, or we should have done something to fix it. And the story I like to tell about this is I worked with a woman who had gotten into a car accident, a really bad car accident where a semi veered into their lane and they were hit, and they were in a very large truck. They were hit head on. And they were told that if they hadn't been in that big truck, they would have died. But she broke her femur, which is a really intense, it was a terrible break, really intense physical pain, and it took a long time to rehabilitate and heal, and it was very disorienting and painful and traumatic. And post the accident, I met her, I was working with her a month after the accident, something like that. She was still on crutches, still in a lot of pain, doing physical therapy. And she and her boyfriend had stopped 10 minutes before the accident and gotten Red Bull at the gas station. And her way of trying to get some power over the situation was to give up Red Bull. That she just decided that, if she hadn't had the Red Bull, she wouldn't have been in the car accident. So, Red Bull was the thing that she could do to try and get some power over a situation. Giving up Red Bull would mean she would have not been at the site of the accident. So you can see how arbitrary that is. Red Bull didn't cause the accident. Wanting Red Bull or stopping and getting Red Bull didn't cause the accident. And yes, maybe she wouldn't have gotten in the accident if she hadn't been in that place at that time. But really she was entirely powerless over this circumstance, and lucky she was in the one vehicle she was in instead of another one. So, we can see how irrational this mechanism of putting ourselves at the center of the story is. But it's very tempting, because if we could put ourselves at the center of the story, we could gain some power over a situation in which we might be largely or, mostly or even entirely powerless. And that powerlessness is overwhelming. Actually feeling that powerlessness can be very difficult. We need our adult consciousness in place in order to be able to tolerate our powerlessness and to tell ourselves the truth about it, to be able to discern and perceive, what do you have power over? What do you have influence over? What are you powerless over? And to actually be able to see the whole truth about that. So very often I'll meet people who are victims of childhood abuse in some way, and they'll have some story about, being responsible in some way for hurting somebody else or for getting hurt, like they caused themselves to get hurt by acting wrong, or they should have been able to stop the adult from doing it. Not, when I'll ask about that, what happened in that situation that you think you could have stopped that from happening to you, they'll be talking about being a 9-year-old stopping a 30-year-old from hurting them. And it's just not very likely that 9-year-old would actually have any power over that situation or even influence over it. That, the vagaries of getting hurt one day and not the other day, being able to stop somebody from hurting you on a day by being good, that's all just, the perpetrator is the perpetrator. The person doing it is the one responsible for that action. The victim is the victim. The victim is somebody who it was done to, and it's very unlikely that there was actually, the victim caused it. This is victim blame, essentially, when we're saying, I caused that bad thing to happen to me by being bad. Like rape victims caused themselves to get raped by wearing a short skirt or something like that. So we very often will try and put ourselves at the center of a story so that we don't have to feel our powerlessness. And what we're really looking for as we cultivate our adult consciousness around these kinds of stories is we're looking for the awareness of our powerlessness, our acceptance and our tolerance of our powerlessness, and being able to tell ourselves as much of the truth as possible about what we had power over, what we had influence over, and what we were powerless over. And then once we accept that, being able to forgive ourselves for not being able to do something to change our circumstances, not being able to make enough of a difference to protect ourselves, not being able to, be lovable enough or special enough or kind enough to keep the perpetrator from hurting us or keep that car from hitting us. So we're really looking for that self-forgiveness process to help us integrate and release the story around the trauma experience, the way in which we tell ourselves it's our fault or there's something wrong with us, or we in some way falsely are telling ourselves some story that tries to give us power over our powerlessness. So we're looking for that truth to come into our consciousness as well and really organize around that truth. So I hope this focus on trauma is helpful to you, that if you have any questions about trauma or how trauma affects your thinking, how trauma affects the thought cleanse, I'd be delighted to discuss that with you. You're welcome to email me or send me a text, and or you can post a comment in the Facebook group, and I'll happily respond to it. And I think that's all I wanted to address for today. This is the conversation about and the way that trauma affects our looping thoughts. Hope you have a great day, and I look forward to talking to you soon.